A nun and a priest were traveling across the desert when, halfway through their journey, their camel showed signs of giving out. They set up camp, hoping for rescue, but days passed, and the camel eventually died. Realizing they were doomed, they spent their remaining time praying and reflecting on their lives. Eventually, the priest turned to the nun and said, "Sister, before I die, there's something I've always wanted to see a woman naked. Would you grant me this final wish?" The nun hesitated, but after some thought, agreed. As she removed her clothing, she said, "Well, Father, I've never seen a man naked either. Would you mind?" The priest nodded and stripped down as well. The nun stared for a moment before pointing and asking, "Father, what is that thing hanging between your legs?" The priest smiled and explained, "Ah, my child, that is a gift from God. If I place it inside you, it creates new life." The nun's eyes widened. "Well, in that case, stick it in the camel." At the ripe age of 70, old Mr. Thompson shocked the town by marrying a lively 20-year-old woman. People whispered, but he simply grinned and said, "Age is just a number." A year later, the couple arrived at the hospital's delivery room, where a beautiful, healthy baby boy was born. The nurse, astonished, turned to Mr. Thompson and asked, "Yours?" "Yes," he said proudly, puffing out his chest. "Well, congratulations," the nurse replied. Mr. Thompson winked. "The old engine still runs." 2 years passed, and once again they were back in the delivery room. This time, a baby girl arrived, healthy and perfect. The nurse, recognizing him, raised an eyebrow. "Yours?" "Yes," he said, grinning ear to ear. "Well done," she said. "The engine still runs," he boasted. 2 more years went by, and sure enough, Mr. Thompson and his wife returned once again. Another healthy baby boy was born. The nurse smirked and asked, "Yours?" "Of course," he beamed. "That's really impressive," she admitted. Mr. Thompson chuckled, patting his chest. "The engine is still running." The nurse leaned in with a knowing smile. "Well, you might want to change the oil, Mr. Thompson. This one came out a little black." Marvin lay in his hospital bed. His family gathered solemnly around him. His breathing was shallow, and everyone knew the time was near. His longtime preacher stood at his side, offering comfort in Marvin's final moments. Suddenly, Marvin's eyes widened, and he weakly motioned for a pen and paper. The preacher, thinking this might be his final message, a last bit of wisdom for his loved ones, quickly found a notepad and handed it to him. Marvin's trembling hand scrawled something onto the paper. Before anyone could read it, Marvin took one last breath and was gone. The preacher, overcome with emotion, carefully tucked the note into his jacket pocket, thinking it best to read it later. Days later, at the funeral, as he stood before the congregation, the preacher suddenly remembered the note. "Before Marvin passed, he handed me a message," the preacher announced. "And knowing Marvin, I'm sure it contains something profound. Perhaps a lesson, a final blessing, or words of wisdom we can all cherish." With reverence, he slowly unfolded the paper and read aloud, "Hey, you are standing on my oxygen tube." Late one night, Margaret shot up in bed, breathing heavily. Her husband, Harold, groaned and rubbed his eyes before switching on the bedside lamp. "What's wrong, dear?" he asked, squinting at her. "I had a terrible dream," Margaret whispered. "I dreamed that I died, and you remarried." Harold, still half asleep, let out a small chuckle. "Oh, honey, it was just a dream. Go back to sleep." But Margaret wasn't done. "No, really, Harold, if I died tomorrow, would you remarry?" Harold hesitated. He knew this was a dangerous question, but he sighed and answered honestly, "Well, I suppose I would. I wouldn't want to be alone forever." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Would you two live in this house?" Harold scratched his head. "I mean, yeah. We just finished paying off the mortgage." Margaret crossed her arms. "Would she sleep in this bed?" Harold smirked. "Well, sure. It's a brand new mattress. No sense in getting rid of it." Now fuming, Margaret threw her arms up. "Would she use my golf clubs too?" Harold, without missing a beat, replied, "No, she's left-handed." The lamp went off. Margaret didn't sleep the rest of the night. A curious tourist was hiking through a remote village with his local guide when suddenly the guide sprinted up a hillside to a dark cave. "Woo-woo!" he called into the entrance. He paused, listening. Then, from the depths of the cave, a soft and sultry voice echoed back, "Woo-woo." Without hesitation, the guide tore off his clothes and rushed inside. 15 minutes later, he re-emerged, looking quite pleased with himself. The two continued their trek until, a little farther up the trail, the guide repeated the ritual. Another "woo-woo," another whispered reply, and once again he disappeared into the cave. Baffled, the tourist finally asked, "All right, I have to know, what exactly is going on?" The guide grinned. It's a tradition in my village. When a woman is feeling romantic, she waits in a dark cave. If a man calls woo-woo and she responds, that means she's ready. No one sees who's who. It's just nature taking its course." The tourist's eyes lit up. "That sounds amazing. Can I try?" The guide shrugged. "Sure. The next cave is all yours." Eagerly, the tourist sprinted ahead. He reached the mouth of a deep, shadowy cave and, with all the confidence in the world, called out, "Woo-woo!" A deep, thunderous "woo-woo" bellowed back. Grinning ear to ear, he tore off his clothes and charged inside, and was promptly flattened by a speeding train. Two buddies were out for a stroll. One had a big, tough Doberman Pinscher, and the other had a tiny Chihuahua. As they walked past a fancy restaurant, the guy with the Doberman nudged his friend. "Let's go in and grab something to eat." His friend shook his head. "We can't, genius. We've got dogs." The Doberman owner smirked. "Just follow my lead." He pulled a pair of dark sunglasses from his pocket, put them on, and confidently marched toward the entrance. The bouncer at the door stopped him. "Sorry, pal, no pets allowed." "You don't understand," the man said, gesturing to his Doberman. "This is my seeing eye dog." The bouncer raised an eyebrow. "A Doberman? Never seen that before." "Oh, yeah," the man said smoothly. "They're using them now. Excellent protection against muggers, and they've got great eyesight." The bouncer shrugged. "All right, go on in." The guy with the Chihuahua watched in amazement. Well, if that worked for him. So he put on his own sunglasses and walked up to the door. The bouncer immediately stopped him. "Nice try, buddy, no pets." "You don't understand," the man said confidently. "This is my seeing eye dog." The bouncer squinted at him. "A Chihuahua?" The man froze. Then, throwing his hands in the air, he yelled, "A Chihuahua? They gave me a Chihuahua?" For weeks, my wife had been reminding me, nagging me, to varnish the wooden seat on our toilet. And for weeks, I had been putting it off. But finally, while she was out shopping, I decided to get it done. Feeling rather accomplished, I admired my work and then left the house to take care of a few other things, letting the seat dry in peace. Unbeknownst to me, my wife came home shortly after. She went straight to the bathroom, undressed for her shower, and as one does, sat down on the toilet. That's when things took a turn. When she tried to stand up, she realized, to her horror, that she couldn't. The varnish wasn't quite dry, and now she was well and truly glued to the seat. I walked in a little later and heard a very distressed, "Honey, we have a problem." After several failed attempts at pushing, pulling, and prying, it became clear. The seat wasn't letting go without a fight. With no other choice, I grabbed a wrench and unbolted the entire toilet seat. Wrapped in a bedsheet and clutching the wooden throne, my wife sat in the passenger seat as I drove, red-faced, to the emergency room. A nurse took one look and quickly ushered us into a private room. Moments later, the doctor came in, assessing the situation with the kind of professionalism only years of training could provide. Trying to ease the awkwardness, my wife forced a smile and said, "Well, doctor, I bet you've never seen anything like this before." The doctor smirked and replied, "Oh, I've seen plenty. I just never saw one mounted and framed." A little boy lived out in the countryside, where his family still used an old-fashioned outhouse. He hated it. It was scorching hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter, and no matter the season, it stank to high heaven. Worse yet, the outhouse sat precariously on the edge of a creek, taunting him every time he had to use it. One day, after a heavy spring rain, the creek swelled with rushing water. The boy stared at the outhouse, a mischievous idea creeping into his mind. If there was ever a time, this was it. Determined, he grabbed a long pole, braced himself, and began to push. It took some serious effort, but eventually, with a mighty shove, the outhouse teetered, wobbled, and finally crashed into the creek, floating away with the current. That evening, as the family finished supper, the boy's father looked at him with a knowing expression. "Son," he said, his voice firm, "we're going to the woodshed after dinner." The boy's stomach dropped. He knew what that meant. Desperate to avoid a spanking, he quickly confessed, "Dad, I won't lie, it was me. But today at school, I learned that when George Washington chopped down his father's cherry tree, he told the truth, and he didn't get in trouble." His father nodded slowly, then leaned down with a smirk. "That may be true, son, but I reckon George Washington's father wasn't sitting in the cherry tree when he chopped it down." Dear son, I'm writing this slowly because I know you can't read fast. We don't live where we did when you left. Your dad read in the newspaper that most accidents happen within 20 miles of home, so we moved. I won't be able to send you the new address because the last Arkansas family who lived here took the house numbers with them. Figured it'd save them the trouble of changing their address. This place has a washing machine now. The first day I put in 4 shirts, pulled the chain, and haven't seen them since. It only rained twice this week, 3 days the first time and 4 days the second. About that coat you wanted me to send, Aunt Sue said it was too heavy to mail with those big buttons on it. So we cut them off and put them in the pockets. We got a bill from the funeral home. It says if we don't make the final payment on Grandma's funeral, up she comes. Your sister had a baby this morning. I don't know yet if it's a boy or a girl, so I can't say whether you're an aunt or an uncle. Your Uncle John fell into a whiskey vat at the distillery last week. Some men tried to pull him out, but he fought them off playfully. So he drowned. We had him cremated. He burned for 3 days. 3 of your friends drove off a bridge in a pickup. The driver managed to roll down his window and swim to safety. The other 2 drowned. They couldn't get the tailgate down. Not much else has happened around here. If you don't get this letter, let me know and I'll send another one. Love, Ma. After 37 years of marriage, Jake left his wife, Edith, for his much younger secretary. His new girlfriend insisted they live in Jake and Edith's multi-million-dollar home. Since Jake had better lawyers, he won in court. He gave Edith just 3 days to move out. On the first day, she packed up her belongings into boxes and crates. On the second day, she hired movers to take everything away. On the third day, she decided to treat herself. She set the dining table with candlelight, played soft music, and indulged in a feast, shrimp, caviar, and a bottle of fine Chardonnay. When she was done, she went through every room and carefully stuffed half-eaten shrimp shells, coated in caviar, into the hollow of all the curtain rods. Then she cleaned up and left. Jake returned home with his new girlfriend, and for the first few days, everything was perfect. But soon an awful stench began to spread through the house. They tried everything: deep cleaning, scrubbing, airing the place out. They checked the vents for dead animals, had the carpets professionally cleaned, and filled the home with air fresheners. Nothing helped. They brought in exterminators who set off gas canisters, forcing them to leave for a few days. The smell only got worse. Desperate, they ripped out the carpets, repainted the walls, even replaced the ventilation system. Still, the stench remained. Guests stopped visiting. Repairmen refused to enter. The maid quit. Eventually, they had no choice but to move. They slashed the price of the house, but no buyers were interested. Word spread, and even realtors refused to list it. With no other option, Jake and his girlfriend took out a massive loan to buy a new home. One day, Edith called Jake to check in. He vented about the mystery stench that had ruined his life. She listened sympathetically, then sighed. "You know, I really miss my old home," she said. "I'd be willing to take it back if it means we can settle the divorce for a lower amount." Jake, thinking she had no idea how bad the smell was, jumped at the chance. They agreed on a price, just a fraction of what the house was once worth. She signed the papers immediately. A week later, Jake and his girlfriend stood outside, smiling as the moving company packed up their belongings for their fresh start, including the curtain rods. A woman goes to the doctor, deeply worried about her husband's explosive temper. "Doctor," she says, "I don't know what to do. My husband loses his temper over the smallest things. It scares me." The doctor nods and says, "I have just the cure for that. The next time he starts getting angry, take a glass of water and swish it around in your mouth. Keep swishing, don't swallow, until he either leaves the room or calms down. 2 weeks later, the woman returns looking refreshed and relaxed. "Doctor, that was amazing!" she exclaims. "Every time my husband got angry, I swished water in my mouth, and like magic, he calmed right down. How does that work?" The doctor smiles and says, "The water does nothing. It's keeping your mouth shut that does the trick." Out on a quiet stretch of land, an old rancher was tending to his chores when a black SUV rolled up, kicking up dust as it came to a stop. A stern-looking FBI agent stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses before marching toward the rancher. "Sir," the agent announced, "we received a tip that you might be growing illegal substances on your property. I need to take a look around." The rancher, unfazed, wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "Sure thing, officer, just don't go over there," he said, pointing toward the far field. The agent's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" he snapped. "I don't think you understand. I'm a federal agent. I go wherever I want." With that, he yanked out his badge and shoved it right in the rancher's face. "See this? This badge gives me authority over everything on this land." The rancher simply shrugged. "All right, then," he muttered, returning to his work. About 15 minutes later, a blood-curdling scream echoed across the ranch. The old man looked up just in time to see the FBI agent sprinting toward him, arms flailing, panic in his eyes. Behind him, a massive, angry bull was charging at full speed, closing the distance fast. The rancher dropped his tools, ran to the fence, and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Your badge!" he hollered. "Show your badge to the bull!" A blonde was driving down a quiet highway when the sky darkened and a fierce snowstorm rolled in. Within minutes, the road was blanketed in white, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. She gripped the wheel, trying to stay calm, and then remembered something her dad had once told her. "If you ever get stuck in a snowstorm, just find a snowplow and follow it." Sure enough, just as she was starting to worry, the flashing lights of a snowplow appeared up ahead. Relieved, she carefully pulled in behind it and followed along, staying close as it cleared the way. She trailed the plow for nearly 45 minutes, weaving back and forth as it pushed the snow aside. Finally, the plow came to a stop. The driver climbed out, walked over to her car, and knocked on the window. She rolled it down, smiling. "Ma'am," he asked, "why have you been following me?" She eagerly explained, "My dad always told me that if I got stuck in a snowstorm, I should find a plow and follow it." The driver chuckled, nodded, and then said, "Well, I'm all done with the Walmart parking lot. Do you want to follow me over to Kmart next?" Long ago, in the prehistoric wilderness, 3 dinosaurs were wandering through the jungle when they stumbled upon something strange, a golden lamp half buried in the dirt. Curious, they brushed off the dust and gave it a rub. Suddenly, with a puff of smoke, a towering dino genie appeared, his shimmering scales glowing in the sunlight. "You have awakened me!" the genie boomed. "I shall grant you 3 wishes, 1 for each of you." The first dinosaur stepped forward, deep in thought. After a moment, he grinned. "All right, I know what I want, a big, juicy piece of meat." With a flash, the ground shook as an enormous, perfectly marbled slab of meat appeared before him. His mouth watered as he admired his delicious prize. The second dinosaur, not wanting to be outdone, thought even harder. "I know! I want a shower of meat!" The genie snapped his fingers, and suddenly, steaks, ribs, and drumsticks rained from the sky, covering the dinosaur in a glorious downpour of prehistoric barbecue. The third dinosaur, determined to have the best wish of all, furrowed his brow and thought harder than both of them combined. Then his eyes lit up. "I've got it!" he roared. "I want a meteor shower!" On her first day at a new office, a blonde woman was given the task of setting up her computer. Hours passed, and her boss was impressed by how focused she seemed, sitting in front of the screen for a solid 11 hours. At the end of the day, the boss approached her and asked, "Hey, you seem to have worked so hard today. What were you working on?" The blonde woman, with a proud smile, replied, "Well, I spent the entire day fixing the keyboard. It took a while, but I finally got all the ABCs back in the right order." At 82 years old, Morris still had a spring in his step. or at least he liked to think so. During a routine checkup, his doctor listened carefully to his heart, furrowed his brow, and gave him some important advice. A few days later, the doctor was strolling through town when he spotted Morris walking down the street. But he wasn't alone. On his arm was a stunning young woman, radiant, stylish, and easily 50 years his junior. Morris had a grin as wide as the boulevard. Shaking his head in amusement, the doctor let it slide. But when Morris came in for a follow-up appointment, he couldn't resist bringing it up. "Hey, Morris," he said, crossing his arms. "I saw you the other day. You seem to be doing great." Morris beamed. "Just following your advice, Doc." The doctor frowned. "My advice?" "Yeah," Morris said proudly. "You told me. Get a hot mama and be cheerful." The doctor sighed and rubbed his temples. "Morris, I didn't say that. I said, you've got a heart murmur. Be careful." Old Mr. Thompson, a notoriously stingy lawyer, had spent his life hoarding every penny he earned. But when he was diagnosed with a terminal illness, he became fixated on proving one thing, that the old saying, "you can't take it with you," was wrong. After days of careful thought, he devised a plan. Calling his wife to his bedside, he spoke in a hushed but determined voice. "Margaret, I need you to do something very important for me." She leaned in, nodding. "Of course, dear. Anything you need. Go to the bank and withdraw enough cash to fill 2 pillowcases." Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She had long since learned not to question her husband's obsession with money. "Then," he continued, "take those pillowcases up to the attic and place them directly above our bed. That way, when my soul leaves my body, I'll reach up, grab the bags, and take them with me to heaven." Margaret sighed, but did as he asked. A few weeks later, Mr. Thompson passed away. His funeral came and went, and life slowly returned to normal. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, Margaret stumbled upon the 2 forgotten pillowcases, still stuffed with cash. She stared at them for a long moment before shaking her head with a chuckle. "Oh, that old fool," she muttered. "I told him he should have had me put the money in the basement." On the evening of her 70th birthday, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons checked into a cozy little motel. She had spent the day celebrating quietly with a slice of cake and a glass of wine. But as the night wore on, a sense of loneliness crept in. With a mischievous twinkle in her eye, she thought, why not do something daring? Flipping through the motel's phone book, she landed on a full-page ad for Tender Tony, a professional escort and massage therapist. The photo was enough to make her heart race. Tony had all the right muscles in all the right places, wavy hair that begged to be touched, legs that looked like they could run a marathon, and judging by that dazzling smile, the kind of charm that could melt butter. Eleanor felt a rush of excitement. What the heck, nobody will ever know. Without giving herself time to second guess, she picked up the phone and dialed the number. A deep, velvety voice answered. "Good evening, ma'am. How may I help you?" Her pulse quickened. Oh my, he sounds even better than I imagined. Afraid she'd lose her nerve, she dove right in. "Hi, I hear you give an amazing massage, but let's cut to the chase. I don't just want a massage. I want passion. I want excitement. I want things I haven't had in years." Taking a deep breath, she continued, "I want it hot, and I want it now. Bring rubber, leather, whips, everything you've got. Tie me up, cover me in chocolate syrup and whipped cream. Just let your imagination run wild. I'm ready for anything. Now, how does that sound?" There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice calmly replied, "That sounds absolutely fantastic, madam, but you need to press 9 for an outside line." Carlos was thrilled when his relatives from Mexico came to visit him in the U.S. for the first time. Wanting to give them a true American experience, he decided to take them to a football game. His uncle, Jose, was especially excited. He had never been to a live sporting event before. However, by the time they arrived at the stadium, most of the seats were taken. The only ones left were way up in the nosebleeds, partially blocked by a massive support column. Carlos felt a pang of embarrassment as they climbed to their spots. "Uncle, I'm so sorry," he said, shaking his head. "These seats aren't great. We can barely see the field from here." But Jose just laughed, patting his nephew on the shoulder. "Don't worry, mijo. I'm just happy to be here." As the game began, Carlos couldn't help but notice something. His uncle was absolutely loving it. He clapped along with the crowd, cheered at every play, and grinned from ear to ear the entire time. By the time the final whistle blew, Carlos couldn't hold back his curiosity any longer. "Uncle Jose," he said, "I'm so glad you had fun, but tell me, why were you so happy? We could barely even see the game." Jose turned to him, his eyes shining with emotion. "Ah, Carlos," he said, "I was so touched by how friendly everyone is here. The whole stadium stood up at the beginning and asked me, 'Jose, can you see?'" When Robert rented a room from Mrs. Thompson, he struck a special deal with her. He'd pay extra if she packed his work lunch every day. On the first morning, she carefully prepared his meal: a hearty meatloaf sandwich on soft white bread, a crisp apple, and a bottle of soda. That evening, when Robert returned home, he smiled politely and said, "Mrs. Thompson, that lunch was lovely, but I have to admit, it wasn't quite enough to keep me full." Taking the hint, she stepped up her game the next day. This time, she packed 2 sandwiches with thick slices of turkey, a side of salad, some crackers with peanut butter, and even a slice of cake. That night, Robert returned and, ever so apologetically, said, "That was delicious, but I still found myself a little hungry. Would it be possible to add just a bit more?" Mrs. Thompson, now fully committed to the challenge, went all out. The next day, she used long, thick slices of sourdough to make a pair of massive sandwiches and added crackers, chips with dip, fresh veggies with ranch, and a full 2-liter bottle of soda. Surely this would be enough. That night, Robert returned home, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "that was almost enough food." At this point, she was starting to wonder if she was feeding him or his entire workplace. Deciding to put an end to this once and for all, she cut an entire loaf of bread in half, stuffed it with pounds of meat and cheese, piled on lettuce, tomatoes, onions, and sauces, and wrapped it up like a small suitcase. That evening, when Robert walked through the door, Mrs. Thompson awaited his verdict. He looked at her, raised an eyebrow, and with a completely straight face said, "So, I see we're back down to just one sandwich?"